Hello, I'm Gina Clifford, and together with my co-host, Louise Mowbray, we are in conversation. And today we are having a wonderful conversation with Mark Collen, a wonderful music industry expert. And we are diving into the future of music and touching on living with AI. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more and give us some background into your expertise and
Sure.
your interests?
Thank you very much, Gina and Louise. My name's Mark Collen. I've been in the music industry, a fair amount of time, my entire career actually, ranging from working for companies such as A&M Records, where I started in Paris, and then EMI Records for around 20 years, where I was involved in international marketing and running labels, and then overseeing global marketing for them. And then most recently with Sony Music, where I was overseeing international operations for Sony Music UK. So coordinating and overseeing global strategy on a number of their major artist campaigns.
That's fantastic. So, Mark, we were talking earlier about where the music industry has come from and the threats that have happened over the past few decades from technology, and how that ended up being kind of a stimulus to broaden the types of things that music can be to people, and ways that people can listen to it, express themselves through it. And then that leads us to how artificial intelligence is coming onto the scene right now. And now we're thinking, gee, how is that going to disrupt the music industry? How is that going to shape it? Is it going to replace artists? It's a huge conversation. And Louise and I would love to have this conversation with you. And let's just kick off by giving a little background on some of the things in the past that you had mentioned that had disrupted the music industry, even back into the 60s, 70s, with some technologies that came on board. And let's go from there.
Okay. Well, I mean, as an industry, yeah, I mean, it's interesting to use the word threat. I mean, I guess at times they probably look like threats, but the opposite of that is obviously an opportunity. And the industry's always it's an incredibly exciting industry that's become very comfortable with disruption and change. It never really stands still, and it's had to adapt as technology evolves. And the industry really grew up on the back of technology, right from way back from the cylinder disc. We're in more than 100 years ago, around how music was distributed. But certainly from the 60s onwards, you obviously had the explosion of vinyl records and the channels of distribution, which were largely controlled by a small number of companies. And then, that was a very successful model, and it sort of that's my dog barking. Is that very disruptive in the background?
No, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, let me take that bit again. So through the 70s, vinyl was obviously, you're always going to go through creative cycles when, booms in certain genres. And I mean, I don't know if you remember that whole phase when disco came along, and then you got into the early 80s and it was like, oh no, disco is dead, and all of that. That's a fashion thing, and it's a consumption change, but the actual underlined distribution product, the technology, was vinyl and was embraced and was ubiquitous. Then CD came along, but we also had cassette around that time, which was, a portable format, which made music mobile. And whilst the quality wasn't great and tapes would stretch, and you'd get the wow and flutter on a tape in your car deck, and you had the 8-track and all of that, it was a way of getting music mobile, which then with cassette, that became the Walkman, which obviously revolutionized consumption of music. But then, of course, the big game changer was CD, which was phenomenal. And that was a boom time for the music industry, because it enabled not just, you could get more content on a single. You could, I remember buying my first CD way back when it first came out. It was a Peter Gabriel album way back in the 80s. And I couldn't believe you could actually listen to the whole thing start to finish in one go. Whereas, before, music was limited by format. You listen to, I don't know, big records from that time, Fleetwood Mac, Rumours, whatever, it was 22 minutes aside, because that was the amount of time you could have on a disc. So moving on, we then went from CD, and then you had the big challenges of piracy, because when technology and the internet came along, and people found that they were able to rip content off CDs and file share, and we had that was a perceived threat. It was an enormous threat, and caused immense damage to the industry. But then, as ever, people worked out, all right, how can we make? I mean, I don't know if you ever tried peer-to-peer or file ripping networks. They're pretty difficult to use. You need a lot of time on your hands. So they were big with teenagers who could rip entire music libraries, and people would share them, but complicated. They weren't user-friendly. And then, Napster came along that started to corral it in. And then, of course, that evolved into, the music industry said, no, we need to figure out a way to legalize all this or get everyone to get paid. That's a long discussion. We can't get into all of that. But then, obviously, the evolution of that came to the world of streaming, which is clearly the world we're in now, which was incredibly exciting because it enabled music to be unlimited, and that was the major offering. It was all the music in the world ever, available at a touch of a button. And that was interesting because what that's done is it has, you've seen massive changes in consumption from, going way back to the 60s and 70s, where you would, wait outside and wait for the new album from the Beatles or whoever it might be, and then you rush to the store, then take it home, listen to it start to finish. Now you don't have to do that, and you probably just listen to a track or listen to a playlist, or is curated. So the whole world of curation, which has been around with radio, but now you're in control of it. So it's exciting. It's evolved in numerous ways, and the industry has responded at every level to it. And I think I touched on earlier, I remember talking to people in related media industries that were terribly pleased with themselves at the end of the noughties, going, gosh, look at you guys in the music industry. You don't know what you're doing. Your business has been disrupted and you don't have any answers. A little bit disingenuous. I think we did have the answers. We knew what we had to do, but we have things called contracts. We have things called, there's copyright laws, there's agreements with publishing companies and collection societies, and it's not performing rights societies. These are not straightforward problems that can be solved overnight, but we worked through it all, and I think the industry's in an incredibly exciting phase at the moment.
So we talked earlier, and Louise, jump in as well, because I think you've had some thoughts on this, about artists themselves being replaced by artificial intelligence into the future, maybe not today, but if you have auto-curated lists of music, and so people aren't necessarily listening to a whole album by an artist, does an artist become less important than a kind of music that can be auto-generated by an AI and maybe curated for someone's personal pleasure or taste, depending on the listener's interests? Do you see that as a threat or an opportunity in the future? In the music industry, it might be an opportunity because an AI probably costs less to work with than different artists. But do listeners not really, do they still want to follow an artist and have that artist's music on their playlist, or do they just want music that fits their mood? I guess it's not an easy question, and there's no right or wrong answer, but I would love Louise's take on this as well.
No, it's not an easy question at all. And I think, as I say, we've lived with change forever in music. We were laughing earlier, we were talking about when the synthesizers of the 70s, which were very basic instruments, but created that very cool electronic sound that we all came to love, that eventually found its way into techno and dance music. But when they started becoming polyphonic and then you had sampling come along and you could replicate strings and orchestral sounds, that was seen as a big threat to orchestral players or people that were session musicians, because that was seen as a threat to their livelihood. And in one sense you could have said, yes, it is, but those issues were worked through and everything's lived side by side quite happily, or probably, happily. Some people may not be happy about it, but I think it's just broadened the offering. In terms of consumption and the fans and their allegiance to artists, if you look at, you don't have ubiquity anymore. There's a lot of interesting writing around, we don't have that one gigantic movie star, that one gigantic, I mean, we all on this call, I assume we all know about Taylor Swift, right? And Olivia Rodrigo, like the biggest, and Harry Styles, the biggest stars on the planet, and Adele, but not everyone does, if you're outside certain demographics. But in a way, it doesn't matter, because I remember probably not even that long ago, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people were worried in the live business or in the buildings business, if they owned venues, people were concerned that where are the next generation of stadium acts coming from? Because everyone thought, well, stadium acts they need to look like, the acts that had gone before. And I mean, if you look at the live business now, and if you look at Live Nation stock price, it's pretty healthy. It's extremely healthy. And if you look at the extraordinary demand for people like Olivia Rodrigo and Taylor's tickets, it's off the scale. So fans, people still love artists and artistry. They still want to identify. And at the end of the day, there's an innate need within people to create art, to create music, to create science, to do brilliant things, and that attracts people. That's what makes us magical as people. And there are just some people that are extraordinarily gifted at that, and people will want to listen to follow, to read, to watch. I don't see that changing. I think that what AI can do is broaden those artists' offering. It can broaden other areas of consumption. If you're saying, do people want to follow genres? Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can go on to one of the streaming services and go, yeah, I'd like some sleep music, please, or I'd like this or that. Yes, I get that, but that's just, there's always going to be white noise. Yes, people will want that, but nothing moves people like a song. I mean, it really doesn't, whether it's yesterday, or if you look at that incredibly recent example of the Oliver Anthony music, a guy living, on his land I think in Virginia in the US, who's kind of angry at the world and got something to say, and puts a track out on, Spotify, and puts it out on YouTube and then Spotify. And, 2 weeks later, it's a global smash. It's top 10 in America. And to this date, I think it's done about over 70 million streams on Spotify. I mean, and it's in charts globally because it resonated, it connected. And that was a guy and his guitar and in the video, he had his 3 dogs with him. So you can't, will AI transform that? AI will add to that. I think the market offering becomes different. I mean,
well, I know,
Yeah.
Louise.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Whenever I think of it from an artist's perspective, I can imagine a young person today, and he wasn't so, I don't think he's so young, but a person today who has this creative desire to produce something, perhaps the freedom of, what seems like it's a bit like self-publishing a book, the ability to actually get your stuff out straight away and to be aided if you know how to use the tools. I would imagine from an artist's perspective, that might be, it might feel like the world is much more open. And yet, if we look at the acts that are doing particularly well, Mark, apart from this chap with his, top 10, who's angry at the world, most of them have big machines behind them in terms of, making sure that all of that works incredibly well, and they're able to build that community and following and social presence. I'm just wondering from a creative perspective, is there a fear amongst artists? I mean, I know that certainly things like streaming are opening up emerging markets in a way that, haven't been opened up before, offering opportunities for artists out of Africa and, South American countries and, places that haven't been mainstream until now to actually to reach a broader audience, which you touched on. And I'm just wondering from an artist's perspective, this question of being compensated for your innate abilities and I mean, that's a massive question. And I'm sure that perhaps if you're sitting somewhere in the middle and you haven't quite hit the mark yet, it must be a little concerning. I mean, how does an industry deal with that? It's such a
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it's
messy middle. Yeah.
is it concerning? I think it's thought-provoking rather than concerning. I think the industry is unbelievably resilient, and we know how to adapt. And there are a lot of very smart people engaged at this very point. I mean, all the major companies are looking at AI, both on how can we use it as a tool and as a creative asset, but also as, okay, how do we respond to the environment of AI? And at the end of the day, there's, very clearly defined sets of rights around who owns what, around who owns, master recordings or who owns song rights. And those are very clearly defined and they're very closely controlled. And so there have been instances, obviously the famous instances this year where people have used, sound alikes, and those things will, in a way, they're almost a version on from sampling, where people have gone and reused original samples, which have become a really vital part of music. Who'd have thought that 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that, when you sample things, I mean, some of the most amazing music, listen to some of the fantastic works by people like Kendrick Lamar that use incredibly innovative samples. And, there's a structure for that. There's a process for that. And it's everyone knows what it is. And, those rights are being discussed around AI at the moment. And so I am not aware of conversations with people where they think it's a threat. People are looking at it. I think a lot of music people are incredibly excited by it, because I think if you are, certainly if you're an artist, artists look at themselves now as multidimensional.
Right.
They don't, it isn't just about recording something and releasing it and then, promoting it maybe with live shows or not. It's, the people see themselves working, they see them, a lot of artists, and not everybody. And I think sometimes the strength of an artist is actually focusing on what they're great at. But people appreciate that, they can release music. They can create a live show, which is increasingly becoming a live experience. What is that live experience about? It isn't what, that's evolving, the use of technology within live shows. And then if you look at something like, the ABBA show in London at the moment, which is extraordinary.
Yeah,
or if you look at some of the Vegas shows that people are putting on, these are incredibly exciting, immersive experiences that music is learning from, other areas, Harry Potter and things like that, where people are trying to understand, or theme parks, what can you, how can, and artists are pushing these boundaries. They're asking those questions. They're going to their management teams and their creative people going, what can we do? So they're not just living in that one dimension anymore. So AI, the number of conversations I've been in with people where they're talking about immersive experiences, and AI generated experiences.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. And gaming, I mean, throwing live shows and gaming and
absolutely. I mean, gaming is obviously enormous, and a huge new generation of our artists grew up in that world, are active in that world, and they want to be multi-platform. So to them, we're all sitting around scratching our heads. For a lot of them, this is perfectly natural, and they're just going with it. And, it's, I think, Louise, you and I have talked about this, a lot. And I think Gina, as a futurist, when you're in the future, you don't realize it. You just are, right? So we have kids now that are, complete digital natives, an 8-year-old is completely conversant with what to do with an iPhone. Whereas, other people are fumbling around. I'm simplifying, but
that's a great point.
An artist now, in the same way that maybe back in the 60s, Rolling Stones were starting out or whatever, their craft was go play some shows, go into a studio, have a producer, cut some tracks. That was the kind of the limit of it, and then do more shows and bigger, whatever. Now, look at the tools at the disposal of a producer. Look at what some of the most extraordinary people working in dance music do, like Calvin Harris or Fred again. I mean, the work they create how they create it, and then the experience they bring to their live shows. It's totally different, but to them, it's all part of it.
Yeah, I've been digging into the impact of, I mean, Generation Alpha, which is really, the oldest are sort of pre-teens right now.
Yeah.
But just in terms of the future of work and how gaming will have completely impacted how they think about the world.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about, Mark, is exactly that. So I suppose if you're in the middle of it, you are the future and you are enacting the future in a multi-dimensional way. Then it's part of the process of being creative. That there's no leap at all. I love what you said about that.
I think maybe one of the biggest, and this isn't around AI necessarily, it's just the transition to the world we're in. Perhaps the conversations that we have the most with artists is, the days of, like, as I say, when waiting for the new album by someone to come out and you read about it, oh, it's coming out on this day, and we've probably all done that and go down to the store and queue up and get it. I remember, release point even more recently, really recently, in recent memory, you can remember Oasis releasing an album and there'd be midnight launch parties to go and queue up outside and get it. Now, that's obviously turned on its head because, Generation Alpha and upwards, everything's immediate. They want everything now. Consumption is now. They're not going to wait around. So, it's the windowing of announcement is much shorter. The virality of building up a demand is much shorter. But once something's out, it's keeping up a constant conversation because there is so much out in the marketplace and there's so much competition in terms of consumption. People are not just, the center of their world is not taking their album home and putting it on, listening to it. They're putting in 5 different things at the same time. They're probably streaming something on Netflix, and then they've got TikTok on their phone, and they've got some music on, and they're doing their homework at the same time, and FaceTiming a friend, at the same time.
Digital addiction, in other words.
Yeah. So it's about instant consumption, and that's where, artists like Taylor Swift or Harry Styles are just brilliant because they're constantly part of the conversation, and they understand how to use the different platforms to leverage that.
But I could see artificial intelligence stepping in there, and like Louise, you've used the voice synthesizer, I guess is when you want to call it. It will artificial intelligence software. You record your voice, and it can very accurately replicate that voice, and then you can feed it a script, and it will read it as if you were reading it, but probably flawlessly, right? At some point, it's going to be indistinguishable from your original voice. It'll just be a perfect copy saying what you wrote. And I think what that does in a positive way is it what you just talked about, that immediacy of immersion, people wanting to be everywhere live and through streaming media. Well, doesn't that allow artists to put their voice into something, write some lyrics, put it into an artificial intelligence platform, some sort? Maybe you give it a genre or style, and you give it some tips and tricks on, I want this rhythm and maybe in this key, but then that's it, and it composes something. But because you're feeding it, is it your product? Can you put an album out in an hour instead of months or weeks or years?
Almost certainly. I think it becomes a genre, like we have many genres now. Almost certainly you can do that. And I think that would be, and on certain types of artists and music, that would be perfectly fine. I think the one incredibly vital part, and the reason that, why is music so successful? Why is there a music industry? Music moves people. It's at the core of our being. And I think the word that runs through everything is authenticity. So when we're dealing with artists now, and I'd say there are lots of different genres. If you're making, purely sort of, instant consumption, certain genres of music, yes, there's a place for it. But if you think of some of the greatest songs of all time, the greatest vocals of all time, if you think of Adele, or you think of a Kurt Cobain vocal, No Apologies, that song, or you think of Stevie Nicks singing Landslide, it's that imperfection. That's what gets you. Perfection isn't actually sort of, I mean, I love classical music, but I'm not an expert on it. I mean, I can't, why is one pianist or cellist more revered? Why is Pablo Casals legendary? And there are 10,000 other cellists that haven't got that acclaim. The intonation, the way that string is played, the way that bow goes across, the way Keith Richards plays guitar. It's imperfect, but it's authentic. And that same goes to the tone of voice. And when you look at the way Taylor Swift communicates with her audience, she knows what to say and how to say it. And yes, I'm sure a machine could learn that. But at the end of the day, it's the authenticity. That's the connection. I mean, how frustrated do you guys get when you're talking to chatbots, right? It's not a person, so you have less respect for it, right?
There's a bit of research into that I was looking at actually this morning, funny enough, and the actually quite extensive research. And what they've actually found is that chatbots increase the positivity between the chatbot and whoever's talking to by something, quite a big percentage. However, if so that's fine if you're talking to a call center and it's a chatbot. Yeah. It's fine if you actually know about it. And Gina, you and I have talked about this quite a lot. But if we suspect the person that we're talking to, another human being, not in that context, is using AI to chat to us, then they go down in our estimation. And of course, we lose respect from them. Mark, you also just touched on something else, which is really interesting. I recently just happened upon a little clip, probably, one of those sort of clips, just scrolling through endless clips, losing half an hour. And it was a robot playing every instrument, creating a piece of music.
Right.
And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. So, each arm was holding a, whatever, or playing a string or whatever it might be, and closed my eyes in the middle of it and just listened. Because I thought, okay, well, what does this sound like? Rather than the visuals. And it just sounded completely empty. So I love what you said about authenticity. It's really interesting. There is, even if you don't like the piece of music being played by the artist, or the drummer or the intonations, of course that authenticity is there, but it just wasn't there. And I thought, okay, well that answers that question. I won't be bothering listening to anything that's produced by a bunch of robots in the future. But I would imagine
it's fine if you're in the library music business, or if you're in the soundtrack business, not film sound, because think of movie soundtracks, they're incredibly beautiful and personal, and a well-crafted soundtrack to a movie defines the whole experience, or to a TV series. You think of the music in that piano set, piece in Succession, right?
Yeah.
The theme, it's brilliant, right? And yes, could a machine do it? Maybe, but actually it could probably come up with all the different variants, because there's a brilliant theme, and then it's like, oh, there's an orchestral bit, this, that, the other. But yeah, I just think the center of the clues in the name, the music industry, and music is about artists. They are the center of what we do. Ultimately, there's an industry around it, but ultimately we rely on those special, extraordinary people that have the ability to create art through their voice, or a gift of being able to play an instrument, which is why musical instrument sales are going up again. Guitar sales are up. It's fascinating.
It brings to my mind, Rick Rubin wrote the book, The Creative Act, The Way of Being. Right. And in one of those chapters, I think at the beginning of the book, he talks about some amazing artists that struggle to put out more than one or two pieces a year, or maybe even not that much. And he said that some of the most talented people on the planet, but they lack the confidence in they don't like what they're doing. So I wonder if artificial intelligence becomes a coach for them in a way that isn't replacing their music. It isn't replacing their musical instruments, but it can help them get over that hump of they don't think it's good enough. And maybe this goes to stuff that Louise deals with as a life coach, as a business coach. There are people that are incredibly talented that struggle, and maybe artificial intelligence has a role to play with some of these genius artists to help them either create more content, feel more confident. I don't know if you're aware of anything that's happening in that sphere right now.
No, I'm not really. I mean, the truth is, I know a lot of instances where most artists will tell you the record's not finished when it's delivered. And these generally records are delivered because there's deadlines on them. And they have to be, and the label, says, like, we need this record, and it's got to be delivered by this point to make this, because you've got a tour booked and this has got to happen, or it's Christmas. Certainly going back, I remember there was a quote from Bono and The Edge, I think, about one of their massive U2 records, and it said, they said that they had to take the tapes off them. They would never have finished it. It's like a paper. The work isn't ever complete for a lot of people. So I think possibly, yes. That's what I mean. I think there's a space for AI in that learning, coaching, helping cycle. But artists are artists. So anything that can help them, yes. Whether it will help them go, yep, that's done, I'm thrilled with it. I mean, an artist will keep mixing a record until
it's
eternity.
Beyond mixed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it makes me wonder, just sort of following on from your question, Gina, I would imagine that AI would certainly be able to help with a lot of the processes that follow that creative endeavor, right? How to get it out, how to build a community, how to actually, because without that today, without being multidimensional, I would imagine it's really tricky to make it as an artist without basically delivering what you do, across so many, different ways of consumption, different ways of connection, different communities. It must be really tricky. Mark, I'd love to also ask you about emerging markets, because, you mentioned it, and I picked up on the fact that, of course, with streaming, it opens up emerging markets or other markets in a way. It brings music that we might not have heard before to everybody, anywhere. As long as we've, had the opportunity to hear about it. What's happening in broader markets, and, how does it mix with what we're used to in the Western world?
Use the word opportunity. It's phenomenally exciting, actually. I mean, I think two things. I think streaming, and then the growth of technology that enables streaming. So, high quality Wi-Fi or much better cell networks globally have transformed, the ability for music to travel. And what streaming has done, it's done two things. If you're in the international music business of selling international artists, it's actually made it more ferociously competitive, because, you don't, if you're a UK artist, you're suddenly having to compete much more with local music. So what you've seen first, certainly in Europe, was the explosion of hip hop music locally, because it's a massive genre in Europe, but it's local domestic repertoire, and that's really sort of come to become quite a dominant format. But we've seen K-pop in Korea, and J-pop in Japan, and we're seeing huge local artists in China, and it's local music for local audiences, and that makes complete sense, because if you're in Germany, a German rapper is going to write about issues that are relevant to you and your market, and it's incredibly exciting, actually, because streaming and technology, as in access to streaming, have lowered the barrier hugely for people. And then what we're now seeing that's culturally extremely exciting is obviously the dominance of Latin music globally, which has partly been driven by, it's phenomenally, the quality is so good. Latin music is extremely exciting. If you take a culture of hundreds of years of amazing, music in the DNA of the culture of the continent. It really is. And then you've got, all the different genres of it. Whether it's from traditional music through to, more rock music, through to hip hop, through to just classic Latin rhythms. Ally that with pure population numbers. If you're looking at a streaming platform, you've just got scale because the numbers of people on a different Latin playlist. You make a record in Ecuador, that can be listened to in any Spanish-speaking market in South America. So you've got reach already, and then that almost feeds in itself. The quality is incredibly high. The production values are very high. The passion of the artist and the audience is off the scale. And it's exciting, and it travels, and it appeals into Europe, into Southern Europe. So that's come into Europe. And now we have the same with African music, which is becoming a global force. We're seeing, this year, just in London, we've had stadium shows from a number of African artists for the first time that have been, on the verge and are now breaking through massively. And I think it's incredibly exciting. And you're sort of seeing a lot of these artists African artists working with US companies and producers and Latin. So we're getting probably for the first time a really global sounding music market as well as a global music market. But, just culturally, just this extraordinary melting pot in music, which I think is really exciting. I do think that's really exciting.
That does make me want to ask this compelling question, as we know how large language models work. They take all of these huge bodies of information and they train on it. So, Mark, what you've just described is all of this melting pot of music from everywhere in the world gets fed into a large language model. And what does it create? Does it create a new genre of music that isn't in existence by humans? That I don't know if it inspires different artists to start following and building music in that genre, or does it compete? Just your thoughts on that, and Louise.
That's an amazing question, actually. And you're the futurist, so I'm not. So I'm kind of, I struggle with what does 5 years look like? I don't know, but I think the answer is both of those things, because actually I think you're right. Creative people would find that a tool such as that or access to that unbelievably exciting, because they already do it in certain ways, but actually if you have this huge melting pot and AI can help them create, push boundaries, like I think that's 100%. I can see that. Can it create genres of its own and go and create its own music? Possibly. But if it hasn't got, I think it still needs that human to turn that into something magical, to turn it into, but, there is a lot of machine learning at the moment that will give you a very structured song. It will say, right, you've got to have an intro, you've got to have a pre-chorus, and the chorus comes there, and this, that, and the other, and that's fine. But that's, as Louise said, it's clinical. Now, we're at this point on the cycle, right? And when it gets to this point, I'm sure that will be evolved. But I do think you could have, yes, it can make its own genres, but I actually think the magic will happen from a really inspired creative person taking that and doing something with it.
Whenever I think multicultural and I think music, it reminds me of years ago buying those compilation CDs, Cafe Del Mar or something like that. Latin mix. I love what you said about that. It's such a great question, Gina, because where does inspiration come from? And the more exposure we have to many more sources, the more why not? And this idea of working alongside, we've talked a lot about the fact that AI is going to be a constant companion. We talk about IA rather, where our intelligent augmentation, where AI becomes an assistant to all, everything that we do in so many different ways.
That I definitely
of course, IA puts the human at the center of the equation. Whereas, here we are, of course, very concerned about AI being at the center of the equation. And what I'm hearing from you, Mark, is that as far as the creative process is concerned, we shouldn't be too concerned about the human remaining the center of that create. As you said, that the secret is in the name of the industry. It's the music industry, right?
Yeah.
So that creative, that font of creative inspiration needs to still come from people. There've been a lot of people looking at the fact that, or questioning, or trying to do some research and studies on how creative can AI actually be. And I love what you said about we're only here in the story, because we don't know yet in terms of what that might look like. But my personal hope is that humans remain at the center of that creative process.
Yeah, I certainly hope so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I remember when streaming came along and people were trying to understand what it was, because at that point we were in download world, and then it's like, well, the idea would be streaming. And if you've seen, the TV show based on the history of Spotify playlist, it's interesting because he was going around shopping this thing, and people were like, oh, okay, I don't really get that. Well, a few people certainly got that, but at the time it was, it iterated over quickly, but it iterated, because initially it was like, yeah, well, I want to listen to whoever the artist was at the time, but actually his vision was, no, you're not going to do that. We're going to create playlist experiences for you. Now at the time, if selling that to a record company would have been quite a complicated sell, because at the time we thought in terms of artists, tracks, albums, but actually his world was, no, I'm just going to create this thing where Sunday lunch music, or running on the beach music, or Ibiza vibes music. And it experientially, now fast forward 15 years, that has become the norm. It's become completely, that's totally, which is a challenge for an artist, because how do I create identity within that? But I think the iteration is exactly, it goes from that, it was that then, and now here we are. Who knows, what's the next 5 years in streaming world look like? So
it'd be interesting to have this conversation again in 12 months' time.
Yeah.
Because I think we've just opened the door. And, certainly as far as generative AI, large language models are concerned, it's very much in its infancy. You can almost think of it as a toddler bumping into things.
Yeah.
And let's see what the next year or two herald.
The music industry, it's a smart industry. It learns from itself, and it adapts constantly. So I'm excited by it.
Brilliant. Gina, any thoughts to end on?
I have to agree completely with Mark. Throughout, he said that the magic is in the human, in the artist, conveying something from inside themselves to a massive audience of people that are listening, and they're bringing their own meaning into it. Right? They're taking from it what may be completely different than what the artist intended, but it was obviously emotional. There's an emotional reaction to music, and that's what makes people love it. And so I totally agree that right now, artificial intelligence is not going to replace people in that equation, because it lacks the ability to touch us in that emotional level. But I do think that there is an amazing opportunity for artificial intelligence to be, as we've said, kind of that partner for us, a coach for us, to help us get more ideas faster, to explore new ideas, new genres, new ideas, new collaborations, to push us farther as an artist, as long as we keep people at the center. And I think that music is just one of many different areas in our world today that we need to keep that in mind with artificial intelligence, that people have to stay at the center of things, because if we're not, what happens to us? We're creative beings. Where do we fit in the world?
Yeah.
If we give that up and we give that over to something that's automated and took the body of human knowledge and then made copies or versions of it for the world. And then if people stop creating, that's going to collapse, because there's nothing for it to train on. So we have to stay at the center of things. And I'm excited for the possibilities of what could be with people at the center of artificial intelligence in music and beyond.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Mark. It's been such an interesting discussion, and hopefully we can come back and do it again.
Perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark.